on how Russia sees NATO because A, it helps explain the current crisis, and B, it's something that hasn't been particularly well covered in the media. It's also worth saying that obviously Russia isn't one ideologically cohesive bloc. Not everyone in either Russia or the Russian political establishment sees NATO in the same way. So, just to be clear, when we talk about how Russia sees NATO, we're essentially talking about what the current Kremlin establishment claims to believe about NATO. Anyway, disclaimers aside, let's get into it. As we see, there are three places where the Russian and Western perspectives on NATO diverge. First, while NATO and the West see NATO as primarily a mutual defence pact, Russia doesn't consider NATO to be a purely defensive alliance. Second, Russia doesn't see NATO as an exclusively military alliance. It also sees it as a political and cultural project.
I mean, this is true. This is accurate.
Third,
so far,
Russia
the video
sees NATO not
accurate.
as a post-World War II phenomenon, but a continuation of the West's anti-Russian foreign policy, which began in the early 17th century. Alright, let's start with the first one, the idea that NATO isn't a purely defensive alliance. NATO's official policy states that the alliance does not seek confrontation and poses no threats to Russia, and the only bit in NATO's founding charter that talks about military action is Article 5, a mutual defence clause which says that if NATO members suffer an armed attack, then all other members will defend it. On its website, NATO rejects the idea that NATO is aggressive, insisting that NATO is a defensive alliance. You get the point. NATO clearly self-perceives as a defensive alliance. Russia, however, isn't convinced. And to be fair to them, NATO does have a history of getting involved in conflicts that doesn't really involve its own members.
That's actual fairness from an English-speaking channel that I was not expecting.
The cases cited most often by Russia are Kosovo and Libya. Let's start with Kosovo, where NATO intervened in 1999. At the time, US-Russian relations were already at a low following the election of a former KGB agent as Russian Prime Minister in September 1998, and the US bombing of Iraq in December 1998. Iraq and Russia were allies, and the Americans failed to notify Russia in advance. NATO-Russia relations were also strained in part because the Americans and the Russians weren't getting on, but also because NATO had just accepted Poland, Hungary and the Czech Republic in March 1999, all former members of the Warsaw Pact. On the 23rd of March 1999, Javier Solana announced that NATO would begin a bombing campaign in Yugoslavia against the Serb armies, in order to prevent, quote, humanitarian catastrophe. Somewhat unsurprisingly, this didn't go down well with the Russians. Although Yugoslavia and Russia weren't formal allies at the time, Serbs and Russians share a Slavic and Christian Orthodox history, and Russian nationalists described NATO's bombing campaign as an attack on their Slavic brothers. Now, the Russians never really bought NATO's claim that the bombing campaign in Kosovo was a humanitarian intervention, not least because NATO failed to gain the approval of the UN Security Council, and the campaign itself killed at least 488 Yugoslav civilians. At a time when NATO-Russian tensions were already strained, Russia saw NATO's involvement in Kosovo.
Here's the point, okay? Here's the point. When you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. We talk about this. I'm going to try to reduce this to, like, police brutality, right? When you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Because NATO is a military alliance, the only humanitarian way of stopping active genocide, ongoing conflicts all around the fucking planet is by bombing them. Okay? That's it. It's that simple. And while the bombing of Yugoslavia is one that is contentious for obvious reasons, okay, one that people disagree on, including Noam Chomsky, including Bernie Sanders. The Libyan one is a more recent example and one that is absolutely indefensible.
A dangerous precedent allowing NATO to get involved in conflicts outside of its borders as long as it could come up with some semi-plausible humanitarian pretext. Putin himself described Kosovo independence as a terrible precedent that breaks up the entire system of international relations. From Russia's perspective, in 1999 NATO was expanding towards Russia, which doesn't have a great human rights record, while at the same time saying that we can bomb non-NATO countries for humanitarian reasons. It's a similar story with Libya, where NATO intervened in March 2011 to put an end to Gaddafi's brutal regime against Libyan rebels. While Russia abstained on UN Security Council Resolution 1973, which authorised member states to take, quote, all necessary measures, Russia considered NATO's subsequent campaign excessive and therefore illegal.
Which, by the way, true. Like 100%. 100% true.
The UN tried to pass a similar resolution regarding Syria, Russia vetoed it.
A
clear sign that they...
Again, look at the sign. I'm tapping the sign. Vladimir Putin is bad, but he's right in this situation. Okay? And look no further than what is going on in Libya at the moment, and also understand that like these are disposable countries, okay? These are disposable countries that America and Western interests will just use and fucking cast aside. Ultimately to weaken what America has declared their foreign adversary. Even if millions of people are fucking displaced, even if millions of people are dead as a consequence of this, that's still a W because you got to fucking sell your guns, one side. And on top of that, you weakened economically, politically, the other side that you consider to be a damning foreign adversary. All in an effort to reinforce your hegemonic status. That is what the ultimate goal here is by West, specifically, not even the West. I don't think France, I don't think Germany, I don't think a lot of these countries are interested in what America and especially the UK and even Canada is interested in. I think they're super far away. And the further away you are from Russia and Ukraine, the more aggro of a fucking take you have. Because Germany especially has a trade relationship with Russia. They get their energy from Russia. That is a relationship that you can utilize to your advantage in times when the Russian administration is deciding to do whatever the fuck. France not interested in Libya? Sorry. I was talking about Ukraine. Of course France is in no. I'm talking about Ukraine. France is, of course, it's France. We're talking about North Africa. France thinks it's their territory. That's different. I'm not talking about Libya. I'm talking about Ukraine. Sorry.
They didn't like what happened in Libya and weren't planning on letting it happen again. Russia didn't like NATO's overreach in Libya for a couple of reasons. At the time, Russia was trying to convince Gaddafi to give the Russian Navy access to a port in the Mediterranean, and Russian companies were investing in Libyan oil reserves. NATO's intervention and the subsequent chaos ruined all of that. But most of all, Russia saw NATO's involvement in Libya as proof that NATO had become even more activist in its interventions. After all, Libya didn't threaten NATO in any way, and had even begun to cooperate actively with Western governments in key areas such as nuclear disarmament.
Remember what I talked about? When I said, like, even if you don't have nukes? I don't think Libya ever had nukes, by the way. I don't know why, like, people said, did Libya ever have nukes? I thought that was a lie.
You get the point. After Libya and Kosovo, Russia began to see NATO not...
Russian troops in Ukraine, and we're watching confirmation bias video. Dude, there is no confirmation bias. I have already fucking described that what Vladimir Putin did today is entirely different than what has happened leading up to this. It is an expansionist fucking policy. Okay? That is completely, if the troops are actually fucking moving into Eastern Ukrainian territories to defend Eastern Ukrainian territorial interests and the Russians living in Eastern Ukrainian territories, that is 1,000% an aggressive action that is beyond posturing. I don't know what more you want from me with respect to the situation, okay? Like, I am not in agreement with the peacekeeping mission in Donetsk and Luhansk, okay? I'm not. Better late than never? You fucking idiot. Shut the fuck up. That is entirely different than Russia is going to invade the entirety of Ukraine, okay? That's still unacceptable, but you motherfuckers have been constantly talking about how Russia is invading today, tomorrow. It happened. It's been happening. Okay? You've been wrong this entire fucking time. I'm simply looking at this from the point of view of what Russia can do, okay? What Russia can do and what they can't do, what they have the allowance to do. A full-blown invasion of Ukraine would fucking destroy Russia. Of course, more importantly than that, would destroy Ukraine as well. You know who suffers in that situation? The citizens, the workers in Ukraine and the workers in fucking Russia. Those are the people who get ass clapped.
Merely as a defensive alliance, but also an offensive one that uses the pretext of humanitarian intervention to justify aggressive actions. Russia sees NATO's member support for Ukraine in a similar light.
So glad Hasan is standing up to the Western nations and is siding with Russia and Ukraine. Wait, what?
Ukraine is not a NATO member, but NATO has nonetheless decided to get involved. Now, in NATO's defence, it's worth saying that NATO's action in Libya was supported by the Arab League and involved 14 Arab coalition members, and the UN International Commission of Inquiry on Libya found no breach of UN SCR 1973 or international law, concluding instead that NATO conducted a highly precise campaign with demonstrable determination to avoid civilian casualties. It's also worth saying that NATO would claim that both interventions were genuinely humanitarian, but, well, apparently the Russians don't buy it. On to the second difference. Russia sees NATO
more humanitarian
as a
efforts
cultural
by
and
NATO.
political project as well as a military one. One of the reasons that Russia is so wary of Ukraine joining NATO is that Russia believes that NATO membership will also make Ukraine more politically and culturally Western. And, well, Putin doesn't like the idea of a functioning Western-style democracy on his doorstep. And this is sort of true. NATO is nominally based on democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law.
This part is bullshit. Putin just ordered a peacekeeping operation in Eastern Ukraine. Yeah, I saw. We're gonna move into that after this. Okay? We're gonna move into that in a second once this video is done.
Members who share, quote, Western cultural ideals. Spain only joined in 1982 after a successful transition to democracy. In 1991, NATO told the Visegrad countries that membership was conditional on economic and democratic liberalisation, and Slovakia was excluded from the 1997 Madrid summit because of undemocratic behaviour by nationalist Prime Minister Vladimir Mečiar. NATO's membership action plans, first introduced in 1999, require members to uphold the rule of law.
Oh, I totally avoided this. Hold on, sorry. The idea that like NATO's political okay. This part is bullshit. Okay, this part is bullshit. Portugal was a founding member. It was a dictatorship. The liberal POV that like Russia is fearful of a Jeffersonian democracy is a laughable notion. It's not that. It has never been that. That's not a real thing. Okay. We don't even have like a fucking real democracy. Turkey does not have a democracy. You don't need to have a real fucking democracy to be a part of NATO. That's bullshit. Okay. It's all about strategic interests. And if anyone ever, if any fucking person that has even read a lick of Marxist fucking theory tries to pull that shit on you, shove that back down their throat. That is like literally just the diametrically opposed to dialectical materialist thought, okay? Just the exact opposite. Like no country operates on these like idealistic boundaries, okay? That's fucking bullshit. Anyone that says like NATO is spreading democracy, and that's precisely what the fucking the Russian government fears, like, shut the fuck up, okay? Not real, never been real. You're a fucking psycho, okay? Russia did not fucking annex Crimea because they were fearful of Crimea being democratic or some shit, okay? They annexed Crimea because Crimea historically has majority fucking Russian population, always been a fucking autonomous region, always had military bases, always been fucking Russia's entry point into the Black Sea, incredibly important strategic position, and was legitimately worried. The people of Crimea were worried about the nationalistic rhetoric and the ongoing the ongoing battles in other eastern Ukrainian territories between separatist forces that had become a proxy war for Russia because they were backed by the Russian military against the nationalist forces in the Ukrainian National Guard. Okay? Russia, of course, did not want Crimea, its fucking entry point into the Black Sea, its historic entry point into the fucking Black Sea, where it has naval bases, to be a part of that conflict. Especially considering that there was an overwhelming majority of Russians living there, okay? And they are happy about this annexation. Time and time again has been proven by numerous fucking Western sources. So, that's the main reason. That is the main reason. Not because fucking ideological differences or anything like that. It's bullshit.
Western cultural ideals. Spain only joined in 1982 after a successful transition to democracy. In 1991, NATO told the Visegrad countries that membership was conditional on economic and democratic liberalisation, and Slovakia was excluded from the 1997 Madrid summit because of undemocratic behaviour by nationalist Prime Minister Vladimir Mečiar. NATO's membership action plans, first introduced in 1999, require members to uphold the rule of law, individual rights, and democracy. You get the point. NATO does usually require member states to commit to the so-called Western cultural ideals of democracy.
This part is bullshit. Anyway, that part I disagree with 100%.
Now, this might not sound controversial. Democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law all sound like good things. But Putin sees this apparent concern for human rights as a threat to Russia's political culture. The third and final way that Russian and Western perceptions of NATO diverge concerns history. To understand this point, you need to know that Russian politics, and especially Putin, are big on their history. This was apparent in Putin's recent speech in Ukraine, where he made reference to the Kievan Rus, a 9th to 13th century confederal state covering parts of present-day Ukraine, Belarus, and Western Russia, when describing Ukrainians and Russians as one people. Anyway, most of the West sees NATO as essentially a peacekeeper, there to prevent a repeat of World War II. Putin, however, claims to see NATO as a continuation of an anti-Russian animus in Europe that predates World War II. In Russian historical
this man is a fucking lib and he explains the situation much better than you would ever be able to. Dude, you're bringing up... First of all, I have already talked about Mersheimer. I've shown Mersheimer's pieces of Mersheimer's lecture last 3 weeks ago, okay, when I was in the other room. We had already covered these bases. Secondly, he's literally a fucking professor. Of course he explains this much better. I am not going to fucking sit here and show you guys a 1 hour. Like, stop fucking trying to get me to watch a college lecture when I've already gone over the bits and pieces of this, okay? What the fuck? Ah! Of course he does a better job. Also, he's a conservative too. Like, he's just... From 2015, it doesn't matter. His takes are completely correct. And not only that, but also prescient, because that has not stopped. The problem within Ukraine has not fucking stopped.